My name is Faust, and I'm part of the BloombergNEF team, and we're the primary energy research division for Bloomberg. We look at commodity markets and the technologies driving the energy transition. So, there's been a whole host and flurry of net zero proclamations, targets, aspirations, so much that 90% of greenhouse gas emissions are now covered by some form of decarbonization target. How does that all look? Well, for us here in Asia, we're all aligned on decarbonization largely, be it a carbon neutrality target or an actual net zero target, but all heading in the right direction. How these countries are going to make it to net zero will vary dramatically with their local circumstances that are unique to each and every one of those markets. How have we been making strides, though? Well, our BloombergNEF analysis shows that the policies implemented aren't quite there yet to plausibly achieve deep decarbonization as per what some of the countries have been aspiring to. We have an annual zero carbon policy scoreboard, which evaluates and ranks policies for the G20 countries. And this scoreboard examines six major areas where policymakers can address lowering and limiting CO2 emissions. This is the power sector, low carbon fuels, CCUS, transport, buildings, industry, and circular economy. Largely, the power sector has been doing has made the most strides across the board. This is very much sort of countries committing to bolder interim targets for adding renewable capacity in line with their net zero targets. They vary with country. For example, places like the US and Japan, they're a little bit off from their renewable targets, but places like Australia, for example, have actually met their renewable capacity targets a decade before their target. Everything else, largely still falling behind. And with regards to low carbon fuels, at least half of these countries have also enacted or at least released some kind of low carbon hydrogen strategy associated with it. These policies were based on 2021 enacted policies. So ever since Russia's invasion of Ukraine, energy security and interdependence is front and center again. But there's no reason why sort of cutting GHG emissions can't go hand in hand with some of this in terms of rolling out more renewables, electrification, and energy efficiency in these countries. It is a complex subject, though, and it's a multi-decade problem that we're going to have to be dealing with here. So one of the initiatives that Bloomberg has done is the Net Zero Pathfinders. This is a public resource, and it hopes to give insight to policymakers on how to design and implement decarbonization strategies today for cities, for countries, etc. Managing this in four, shall we say, more palatable pillars for net zero. And this is where we'll be expecting, when we see what's going to happen in Asia, it's going to fall in any of these four particular pillars. The first pillar is accelerating the deployment of mature climate solutions. Straightforward enough, that's renewable energy. So what we saw in BNEF's energy transition investment trends last year was that renewable energy investments still lead the way, completely dominates it. So this is solar, wind, other renewables, etc. That came to a record new of 366 billion committed last year. The second largest sector was electrified transport. So this includes EVs and the associated infrastructure. This came up to 273 billion invested. Asia is still king, obviously, and China leads the way with that. The single largest country for energy transition investment that we captured at 266 billion last year. So Asia-Pacific countries now hold 4 of the top 10 countries in terms of highest energy investments in energy transition technologies or sectors. So this is India and South Korea now joining the likes of China and Japan. For all of these countries, it's the same story about investing in the more mature technologies of renewables and EVs, whereas newer technologies are still falling behind to a certain extent. And the scale is just not comparable at this stage for mature clean technologies versus others. But it's these new technologies which are going to help us reach deep decarbonization in those hard-to-abate sectors. And for us at BloombergNEF, we see hydrogen and CCUS being those two critical technologies for the next phase of decarbonization. Now, hydrogen may not be playing a big role in abatement in the 2020s, but it is going to play a critical role after 2030 if we want to be on track for net zero, if we want to even make it to net zero. So this is why Korea's latest hydrogen plan has doubled their 2030 hydrogen projections. This is why shipyards in Japan are not making LNG carriers anymore. They're making ammonia carriers and LH2 carriers. And similarly, in China, the city of Ordos, a small city in China's Inner Mongolia province, plans to produce 1 million metric tons of green hydrogen by the end of the decade. That is actually the same, that can actually meet 5% of the EU's targeted consumption for 2030 of green hydrogen. So you imagine the scale that's going to come out of Asia for here. With regards to CCUS, this is sort of the storing and giving new life to that CO2 that's been captured. So we're going to have a session on circular economy later, but this is very much upcycling the carbon that we try to capture. Those technologies are a bit more known to us. We just need to manage the scale of it in the next 10 years to actually make them competitive. We can't take our eye off some of the more innovative, more climate solutions. So every year, BloombergNEF launches the Pioneers Initiatives, where we're looking for startup companies and new innovative technologies that will accelerate the low carbon transition, or perhaps in some cases halt climate change, excuse me. The three challenges that we chose this year were scaling carbon removal, providing 24/7, around-the-clock clean power, and also decarbonizing aviation. We heard a little bit about from Boeing earlier. So these three technologies are new, innovative. This is the stuff like you hear, like direct air capture. The reason we see that this is important is just curbing emissions is one thing, but we're realizing more and more that actually getting rid of the CO2 in the atmosphere is going to be critical in making sure that global warming actually does stay below the 1.5 degrees. With regards to, the third pillar is very much just curbing the role of fossil fuels. It's a known strategy, it's a widely accepted strategy, however, the most perhaps politically difficult to do. There are many ways for us to do that, and many ways that Asia will look to do this. You can outright phase out coal, just a direct, I'm closing that coal plant. However, perhaps regrettably, there's still at least 40 countries that have active coal capacity that have not pledged any kind of phase out for coal. The other thing is a carbon price mechanism to actually penalize fossil fuel generation. This is very much gaining track, especially the cap and trade mechanism. So you've got a tax, people don't like the word tax, but carbon tax or carbon market mechanism, ETS. The biggest one now that we're looking at is China, previously Korea, and a small one in New Zealand, but definitely something that's gaining traction. The very last component or strategy is, why all of you are here today, isn't it? It's very much about providing the enablers for this energy transition. It's about getting the financial institutions to be aligned with the net zero targets. It's about getting the communities and everybody on board with this. The benefits of a low carbon transition need to be managed so that they are inclusive for everybody. So when we transition the global economy from high carbon assets to the low carbon alternatives, we need to make sure that the workers, communities are all supported with this. And that's going to be a coordinated effort by all stakeholders, government, businesses, coordination, to come up to have this, as some of the other panelists have talked about earlier, is the just transition. Perhaps one of the most important things and main things that COP27 and Egypt will bring up is who's going to pay for this. I don't think anyone has a solution for that, but maybe those are the conversations that we'll be talking about here today. Net zero. So how net zero is actually going to look for each and every one of the countries is, as I mentioned, going to be different. And we at BloombergNEF, we will be publishing our new energy outlook later this year, which is going to chart the various net zero pathways for some of our tier 1 countries and what that might look like, what are the different technologies and baskets of policies that they're going to need to enact in order to make that happen. So do look out for that.